Well, we are back with Polanus's 18 Axioms on the Trinity, and this time joining both Fred and me is a really special guest. We're really excited to have him on, Dr. Steve Tipton. And Dr. Tipton recently completed a dissertation, a doctorate on Amandus Polanus, and he's going to be telling us about his work on that here in a moment, and he did that at Leuven. He's a PCA pastor at a church in Pennsylvania, and we're just privileged to have him come on and give us some more bonus content on Polanus himself, his life, content, and works, and the issues of doctrine of God that Fred and I have been discussing. So, Steve, thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me. So you wanted me just to sort of begin with kind of a basic outline of Polanus's life. And I think the easiest way to do that, first of all, is just to kind of look at him in terms of his various places of education. Primarily because before he takes up residence in Basel, both as a student and then eventually as a professor, there's not just a whole lot that's known about him. We do know he was born December 16, 1561, in the city of Trappau, Silesia. That is the modern day Opava, which is sort of on the Czech-Poland border on the Czechoslovakian side. He is educated early on at the St. Elizabeth Gymnasium in Breslau or Wrocław, Poland, which is just on the other side of the border. So back then it was all kind of part of Holy Roman Empire, etc. But today it is separated by that border. He was there for 6 years. St. Elizabeth Gymnasium was mildly Lutheran. That's the description that's usually given of it. He would have studied primarily through Melanchthon's textbooks there. But there is some evidence in the secondary literature that even this early on, he's already being exposed to the works of Calvin and Beza. In fact, one of the authors in secondary literature even says by now he's already convinced of Reformed theology. Doesn't give any background for that or any explanation of that, but at least it seems he was already exposed to it. So then in 1583, his university experience begins. He goes, first of all, to the University of Tübingen. There he learns, introduced really to Aristotelian philosophy. A professor who is well known in that time period, Jakob Schenk. It's also there that he finds this interesting dispute going on between Reformed and Lutheran theologians, primarily between Jacob Andreas and Lambert Gano on Romans 9:11, which of all the places to have a Lutheran Reformed debate on. But there is this debate going on, and Polanus takes the Reformed side, and Schenk says, you know, this is not a Reformed place. You might want to go somewhere else. So recommends he actually goes to Basel. So later that same year, he goes to Basel, Switzerland. There he meets Johann Jacob Irenaeus, who's going to be a mentor and eventually a father-in-law to Polanus. He actually lives with Irenaeus for a while, was heavily influenced by his theology. At this point, Basel is a mix of an older Lutheranism that came in after the early Reformation period. It was Reformed and then it becomes Lutheran. And then Irenaeus really brings the Reformation sort of back to the city of Basel, in particular back to the University of Basel. There's always these little pockets of different groups that exist throughout this whole time period. But certainly Reformed theology is newly established in the university or reestablished with Irenaeus. So next year, 1584, Irenaeus is actually called to Heidelberg. He's going to go to the University of Heidelberg, as it switches from Lutheran to Reformed. Polanus goes with him for a little while, but then later in 1584 goes to Geneva, where he studies under Beza, and he's there for about a year when he goes back to Basel. So, I mean, it would be interesting to sort of plot it all on a map, just bouncing all over the place to different universities during this time. But it's while he's in Geneva, according to Polanus himself, where he begins collecting what he calls definitions and distinctions that will become the partitiones and eventually will become the syntagma. It's also interesting that he would put it that way, that he begins collecting definitions and distinctions because at least according again to the secondary literature, he hasn't yet really been introduced to Ramism. It's not until the second time that he comes back to Basel that there's a professor there who is, and I don't have his name in front of me, probably couldn't pronounce it anyway, but anyway, so he comes back to Basel, and this is where he first is introduced to Ramism. Studies there for a little while, travels around for the next 5 years or so. In 1590, he receives his doctorate from the University of Basel. He travels another 6 years. He takes up some tutorships and other things in various places, none at universities, usually working for like wealthy families and things of that nature. But he does come back to Basel in 1596. Now that's the same year that the professor of Old Testament, Brahmuller, dies. He dies in 1596, and Polanus receives that professorship. So he becomes the professor of Old Testament, while Irenaeus is professor of New Testament. And that those two titles causes a little bit of confusion, I think, sometimes. When I was for my dissertation at the defense, one of the internal readers was a professor of Old Testament, and thought it was really neat that he was reading something from a professor of Old Testament in Basel, and I didn't have the heart to break his heart and say that doesn't quite mean what you think it means. So professor of Old Testament at the University of Basel at this time was just the junior of the two theology professors. So Irenaeus was at one point an Old Testament professor, and then I think when he goes away to Heidelberg and comes back, he's the professor of New Testament. And Polanus just takes the junior of the two spots. And it seems that whenever the senior would die or move away, the junior, who was used to be professor of Old Testament, would become the professor of New Testament. So it's in one sense, it's the junior theology professor, but we also have to recognize that Polanus, he studies Hebrew during that period after his professorship, or after he receives his doctorate, so that he will be more likely to get that position. So it's not just a junior theology, but it is the idea that they are supposed to be such generalists that you can move from beginning and teaching the Old Testament and teaching Hebrew to moving to teaching the New Testament and teaching Greek, but also at the same time being a theology professor. And Polanus is going to write a number of commentaries in the Old Testament, but obviously, as we'll get into in a minute, most well known for his more systematic stuff.
Steve, was there also a chair in theology, like dogmatic theology or something like that?
No, there were only two chairs in theology, or in the whole sort of theology orbit there at the University of Basel. Now, there would have been other positions, philosophy and stuff like that, but in terms of just the theology or whatever, it was an Old Testament and a New Testament. I'm not sure how long that existed before this, whether it was like an ancient medieval practice that just sort of comes along, probably, and I don't know how long it lasts afterwards, because certainly you can go to University of Basel and there's quite a few more positions there than this.
Steve, do you know, sorry, just this point is very fascinating to me. Do you know, is this way of having the chairs common to other Reformed universities? I mean, the development of the Reformed university is very complex and scattered, but are you familiar with other places that are doing that sort of thing? It almost sounds like a medieval way of reading text, reading and forming commentaries on the biblical text before being promoted to comment on the sentences and being a theologian proper. Is that?
Yeah, well, it would be interesting to do the comparisons. I mean, Basel is an ancient medieval university. In fact, that's one of the benefits that Basel has, is that they had an already established university during the Reformation. So Geneva and other places really don't have the same benefits that Basel has in terms of, the library, if nothing else, but in terms of just that history and continuity. So it clearly is either going to be something that is just unique to Basel, just sort of developed organically in that university, or is going to be something that was just more on the medieval side, but certainly, looking at just some of the other places that Polanus was, whether it's Heidelberg or Tübingen and Geneva, a very different organizational structure. But I think a lot of that is just there's no one way to build a university now, and there wasn't back then. And I think a lot of it just depended on the exigencies of the place and the time and what was going on. So, certainly not the model for today.
Steve, I know we're about to turn to his theological writing. I want to ask, if somebody, given the complicated history of the region, if somebody says, what's Polanus's nationality? Would you say German, Czech, Polish? What's the right answer?
Yeah, most people say German, and certainly he speaks German. I mean, he's involved in translating of scripture into German. I mean, obviously Luther does, but does follow on sort of translations and so forth. So usually German is what his sort of nationality would be, or at least is what people would consider him to be. I mean, today, again, it's like right on the border between Poland and Czechoslovakia. That had not.
I think we caught him bringing in a Swabian word once as an illustration, the Swabian word for Trinity, which learned that. But yeah, okay, great.
So, yeah, and it's interesting too because so particularly with Polanus in the University of Basel. So once he has that position, he's there for 14 years. He dies 1610, relatively young. Actually, it was interesting working on my dissertation, finishing up in the midst of a global pandemic. He died as a victim of the plague. And so I kept thinking to myself, he's younger than me. I've got to finish this before, but anyway, so, but also just to think about, in those days, and I don't have any of the details, but you hear stories of Reformed pastors, going out and ministering to people in the midst of plagues, and who knows if that's how he got it or whatever else. I don't know, but that part was kind of interesting. But we were talking about something and I completely lost my train of thought.
I just asked about his nationality.
Oh, yeah, right. So sorry. So in that 14 years while he's there, Basel actually gets a pretty heavy influx of Reformed pastors from that region. So from, again, what we consider today kind of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and they were coming because of Polanus. So perhaps some of that time period between getting his doctorate and coming back to Basel, it's another 11 years or so, or no, 6 years, but five years before he gets it and 6 years after, so it is 11 years. He is traveling in that general region, Bohemia kind of region, and so he would have interacted with tons of young people there, and was the reason why they're coming. So I imagine even if he's German, broadly speaking, he would at least appeal to people from that region, have a lot of crossover and so forth. And again, there's very little known about his parents, other than their names and their occupations or where they came from, how long they lived in the area. There's a book, it's right here, sorry, by Bong-Soo Han, was published 4 or 5 years ago, Symphonia Catholica. He has probably the best up-to-date biography of Polanus. Mostly what I did was just sort of summarize what he does. He has far more information than it really should in one sense, in terms of the background of the St. Elizabeth Gymnasium. It's kind of over the top. But if you're interested in that sort of thing, there's a lot of information to pull from him. So. Anything else on kind of background?
One question on something you said, Steve. When he's at Geneva, he starts collecting definitions and distinctions that eventually result in the Partitiones work. Do you have any idea, where is he taking these from? Just broadly speaking, what distinctions and definitions is he, scribbling down? Where is he copying them from?
Well, it's sort of an offhand comment that he makes. If I remember correctly, I believe it's in the introduction to the Partitiones. It may be the introduction of this entire one, but I think it's the introduction to the Partitiones, and the whole idea is that his study under Beza was in seed form what becomes the partitiones, but he doesn't indicate which or what or how or anything like that. And in fact, I mean, even that's sort of interesting because maybe he gets some broadly speaking from Beza, like a classroom setting or something. But Beza's not somebody, I mean, he doesn't quote a whole lot of people anyway, at least contemporaries, but Beza's certainly not among them. I think he has one, maybe two or three that are outside of my area. But I know in the portion of the Syntagma that I was looking at, like one quotation of Calvin, several of Zanchi, and that's kind of it for contemporaries. So it may, maybe come from Beza, but he doesn't say that anywhere. I mean, you never see him quoting Beza. Perhaps he's reading Zanchi because clearly his doctrine of God is heavily dependent on a lot of the things that Zanchi's doing, Ursinus and a handful of others that come before him, but no clear ideas as to who precisely he's getting those distinctions from, or even which distinctions they are. I mean, I think once you start looking through the partitiones, you get a sense for the definition, because that's all it is. It's definitions and distinctions from one end to the other.
Yeah.
And very little else. Well, in scripture quoting, beyond that, that's all the partitiones is. So
yeah,
I think. And
there's a large number of works during this time period, more the earlier period of Reformed Orthodoxy. I think of like Alsted's, he has a similar work, Definitiones Theologiae.
Yeah.
And so I'm not exactly sure myself. I don't really know like what is the stimulus for this and why are they doing it beyond educational material, general guidance for students, but it's very fascinating.
Yeah. Well, we're talking already about his works. As I said a minute ago, he wrote a number of Old Testament commentaries. I actually writes 2 books on logic, several works on predestination, theological works, one on predestination, one on Symphonia Catholica, which is basically just a collection of medieval theological quotes on the various heads of doctrine. It's an interesting read. There he does quote people, because I mean that's all it is. It's just a collection of quotes, and then a number of disputations. And in fact, it's an interesting kind of piece of the kind of academic background of what's going on, and while Polanus is at Basel. So you see, especially go like PRDL, and you look at almost any theologian from the Reformed Orthodox period, you're going to find disputations and theses in the list of what they're doing. One of the things that, I don't know if it was Polanus's idea, Irenaeus's idea, but one of the things that they do in Basel is not only do they have a lot of disputations, but they're also collecting them and publishing them and sending them abroad. And partly to say to the universities, both Catholic universities, but primarily Protestant universities, right, this is the kind of theology we're teaching here in Basel. And so trying to make a name for themselves and trying to establish broadly the kinds of definitions, distinctions, and arguments and so forth they're making. And so there are just a lot of disputations. Now, again, I don't know, just because Polanus's name was on a disputation, he's not technically speaking the author of it. I don't know if you guys have talked a little bit about that, or disputations, or the practice of it. So usually, like if you look at even if they're under a sort of Polanus's name on like PRDL or whatever, you'll see that he is listed as sort of the person who's overseeing it, and then there'll be somebody who's actually giving it. And sometimes there'll be a name of like an opponent given as well. And what is printed is the theses of the person who's giving the disputation. And so it's going to be a student of Polanus who is, the idea is, first of all, they wouldn't have passed him if he's bringing somebody else's theology, right? Unless he is replicating what he's heard in the classroom, they wouldn't have given him a passing grade. They certainly would not have published it unless it was 99% the same thing as what Polanus is doing. So even though his name is attached to it, he's not necessarily the author, the idea is by reading these, you get a sense for the theology that's being taught in Basel or anywhere else. And so again, there's a lot of those, and they are throughout all the various different loci in theology. And in my dissertation, I pick up a little bit in there's a conversation, I can't remember the name of it now. Maybe I can email you and you can put it in the notes or something. But there's a work that's I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 years old. But one of the things it does in that is there's a lady that goes into great detail in the disputations that are being published in Basel and categorizes them according to a whole bunch of different things. So it's interesting, at least to some people. It was interesting to me, the way in which the disputations were collected and then distributed. But again, he's most well known for his systematic works, the Partitiones, and then the Syntagma. So he publishes the Partitiones the same year that he receives his doctorate. So that's a good thing to shoot for, Ryan. After you get your doctorate, make sure you publish your Partitiones. So 1590 and then 1599. So about 9 years after the first, 3 or 4 years after he's already been in the position of professor of Old Testament. And actually between 90 and 99, it doubles in size. So Partitiones has two parts. It has a part on faith and a part on practice. So what we're to believe and then how we are to live in light of that. So between the two editions, the part on good works, the second part, only grows by like 6 or 7 pages. So it's the early section, the section on theology, which grows an enormous amount. I mean, it becomes much, much more detailed. And in fact, if you look at the early edition of Partitiones, it is almost exclusively a definition of something and then the distinction. So, for instance, I mean, theology is either our understanding of God or what we are to believe and how we are to live, faith and practice. But in between the first edition and the second edition, he adds a lot more information, a lot more detail as he goes through. And it is this that sort of becomes the basis then for the Syntagma Theologica, which publishes in 1609, 1610, the two editions. He dies in 1610, so it continues to be published 1617, 1624. And in fact, there are some curious editions in the 1617 edition anyway that I was looking at, and you wonder, where did that come from? Yeah, he's dead. He didn't write those.
I've discovered numerous large paragraphs. I'm sure, I mean, you've done far more work than I have, but even Fred and I discovered, was it just a line or two, Fred, going through this piece? What was it?
Yeah, I can't. There was a very nice paragraph that was in the PDF you were looking at from PRDL,
which was the 1617 edition.
Yeah, that was not in the one I was looking at.
Yeah. So it's very
So
fascinating.
And we had that same thing. Well, he's already dead by this time. How could his works be different?
Yeah.
We don't know.
Well, and one of the interesting things that I saw was, and again, I probably should have prepared a little bit better and looked at it, but there was a section where he's making a distinction that almost immediately after Polanus falls out. It was either in Wisdom or Will. It was one of those two places where he makes a distinction that just doesn't become popular. And that's where it's almost certainly the editor puts in all this information. Basically, it looks like trying to explain away, not trying to explain why Polanus did it, but actually the opposite, trying to explain away the distinction that Polanus has just made. Amazing. And it's really odd. I mean, obviously you know what Polanus didn't write because it's the additional piece, but the way that it sort of slipped in there without any kind of editorial footnote or anything at the bottom, it's just, okay, he didn't mean that, guys, or something.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Kind of neat.
I mean, I guess it kind of indicates that it's still a living text in the sense that you couldn't just consign it to history and say, back in 1605, that's how they talked, but we know better now. It was more like, no, we've got to explain why this is actually true by meaning something it doesn't clearly mean.
Well, and too, I mean, who who, because like Welebius comes after Polanus, he takes that position, and he writes a handful of systematic doctrines too, so systematic theologies too. So it's possible that even a lot of people would consider him to sort of be this, not just the successor in terms of he comes after, but really is taking that body and putting in the slightly less Ramist form, slightly more popular form. So some of that might have even come from him. It's just without, they do things differently back then, so we don't know. I mean, it's neat to try to figure it out, but at the end of the day, you're just making guesses a lot of times. So actually, that's kind of an interesting segue into the next little thing I wanted to talk about, and that just sort of to kind of place Polanus in the broader Reformed Orthodox discussion of what's going on in his time. One of the things that he does fairly extensively, and again, my work is in essence and attributes, and so I do a little bit of work in Trinity, where I have an excursus in the Trinity, where I try to, in like 4 pages, summarize the entirety of book 3 of this entire book. So it is a 30,000 foot flyover of that. But in terms of essence and attributes, you see a lot of Polanus leaning back upon medieval scholasticism in particular. He quotes from Thomas, he quotes from Scotus. I mean, you guys talked about the Beale quote in Trinity. Has a couple places where he quotes, makes reference to Gabriel Beale. Augustine, a whole bunch of other sort of friendly major medieval guys that are safe to quote, so to speak. And actually, most of his quotes are going to be either medieval or patristic scholars. He rarely quotes contemporaries or even like the generation before. He has a couple places where he quotes Zanchi, or rather quotes or references. I mean, sometimes he quotes, but more often than not, he just makes reference, sort of points you to something that Zanchi says. It's also pretty obvious that he builds like his archetypal distinction. He builds that off of Junius. Now, Junius, of course, both of them are building it off of a distinction that then Scotus makes. And so all the different ways that those things come through. But then Scotus has this difference between theology in God and theology in us, whereas it's Junius that really brings forth archetypal language into the Reformed scholastic world. It's also pretty obvious that he's leaning on Ursinus, when Ursinus makes his demonstrations of the existence of God. It is not, he's not leaning on Thomas's 5 ways. It is clearly taking the things that Ursinus is doing and building upon them. And so one of the things you see in Polanus is that he has a very similar theology to his contemporaries. So one of the things that I did in my work is in each chapter, looking at the various aspects of what Polanus is doing. Early on, I have this section called the state of the doctrine of whatever. So the state of the doctrine of God's wisdom in early Reformed scholastics. Really long topic name or whatever. But what I do is I look at a number of contemporaries. So I do look at Ursinus and Keckerman and Buchanus and Naneau and Zanchi, Trocasius Jr. I think that and Perkins, and just look at what they're saying about these doctrines and then compare that, broadly speaking, both in terms of the structure of how they're structuring their argument, but then what they're based, what they're saying. And one of the interesting things is so early on, at least in that group, and I chose that group because they all come before Polanus. I mean, there are other people that come after him that would make also an interesting comparison, but obviously the people that come after Polanus are not influencing Polanus, and so I was more interested in the people that were influencing him. But anyway, so this galaxy of theologians, there are 2 that stand out in that, and one of them is Zanchi. Zanchi's work on the nature of God is enormous. I mean, it puts Polanus's utterly to shame in terms of its depth. And then there's Polanus, and everybody else is much further down in terms of detail anyway. The syntagma, I mean, is the book 2 in the syntagma is fairly decent size. It's not a small work on the essence and the attributes of God. And so one of the things that Polanus is doing is sort of taking what Zanchi has done, a very detailed look at essence and attributes, but on the one hand, sort of distilling it down, because it's not nearly as detailed as what Zanchi does. But also Zanchi does not use as many distinctions as Polanus does. So it's much more of a sort of a narrative discussion, actually much more what you'd find today in a systematic theology. It reads more like a kind of a, I don't want to say too much like a modern theology, but long paragraphs. Polanus reads like a menu almost. I mean, even the syntagma does, where it's very short, very small pieces, all kind of fit together. But still in much more detail than most of his other either contemporaries or near predecessors. But still, he's taking this. His theology is not any different than anybody else's, but he does have a very unique structure. It's obviously influenced by Ramism, but it's also influenced by what Zanchi's doing. It's influenced by what Ursinus is doing. So I mean, there's a lot of carryover there. And certainly with that group at this time, one of the key differentiators of Polanus is the amount of polemics that he engages in. So you guys were talking about that in the Trinity. He sort of saves polemics to the end of that book, where he has those last, I think it's either 2 or 3 chapters that are almost entirely in polemics. Whereas in book 2, he sort of scatters it around depending on what's going on. And usually, I mean, a lot of the doctrine of God, they're unless you're going to argue with the Socinians in every chapter, usually it's just a couple of different places where it's primarily something that perhaps Bellarmine says that we don't like, or the Lutherans or whatever. So it's just a handful of places throughout. No, I'll just keep talking. So sorry. You guys have
yeah, no, that's fine. I did find that I often had questions about his particularity or his distinctness that I realized, well, these are probably not going to show up in this doctrine. Like, since we're working on him on the Trinity, if we really wanted to nail down who he is, we need to get into soteriology and see how he differs. Like, that's where he'd really make a name for himself. Yeah.
Well, and there again, you know, having looked through it, I mean, you know, this is what 4,000 columns or something. It's enormous. But you know, having scanned through a lot of it and looked, you know, quite extensively at the Perquisitiones, particularly the English translation, which I enjoy looking at, because I can just read right through it. But really, where he is unique is the structure that he gives things. It was a comment, actually, I think that maybe Fred made in the introduction when you guys first began this, that if you look at it from one perspective, it looks like the doctrine of God is this huge piece of his overall theology, but really it isn't. I mean, it depends on how you want to look at it, because you know the doctrine of what we are to believe is twofold. It's God and the church, and ecclesiology ends up being a really small portion then of that overall what we are to believe. And what we are to believe concerning God ends up being this gargantuan portion. But all of that would not be what we would consider a doctrine of God. In fact, right, I mean, his doctrine, his soteriology is sort of underneath what we are to believe concerning God. And so if you look at it from a kind of a table of contents, or even, you know, the funky little charts, the ramifications of his doctrine, you really have to dig down to even figure out what are the connective tissue between all of these different doctrines, and how on earth can you have you know, justification where he places it. Because you expect, okay, we're going to do the doctrine God's essence and attributes. We're going to go to Trinity, or maybe you'll flip those depending upon how cool you want to be. And then you're going to talk about anthropology, and then you're going to talk about soteriology, and maybe Christology in between those or somewhere. And to find Polanus's doctrine of the covenant, for instance, I mean, it's just in such a crazy place. It makes sense when you start looking through how he divides it up, but you would never go looking for it there unless you knew where to find it.
Yeah, that sounds like what we saw even in the even just in the axioms we're looking at. You'd expect if you announce you're going to do 18 axioms that there's going to be some sort of parallel or uniform treatment of what an axiom is. But then you get to axiom 14, and it's this sprawling Ramus display of ways of talking about the persons. So it seems like a mind that's really attracted to distinctions, order, systematic overlays on things, maybe a bit too much in some of the charts, right? Like, well, that's kind of overwhelming.
Charts would have been helpful in the syntagma.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
he gives up charts for a summary, but it's actually harder to understand. And the table of contents the index of chapters is horrible because it has almost no comparison to what you're actually going to find. And I mean, you almost need a guided tour of the syntagma even to figure out where things are. So and you mentioned axioms. I actually left that untranslated in my work because it's like these aren't axioms.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not what you expect them to be. They're much more like sort of characteristics or principles or things that we're going to distill down from what we've just talked about.
Untranslated, and you just said axiomata instead of making it look like it's our English word axioms.
And just
that's
left
misleading.
it italicized, whether it's plural or singular, and just did that. Well, and two, if you look at the way that Polanus uses those axioms, we'll use the English word for now. If you look at the way he uses those in book 2, it's very different than the structure of book 3, which is one of the fun things is that he needs an editor, actually, is what he really needed. But there is no fixed way that he does anything. It's just sort of, how do you feel today, Polanus? Well, I feel like doing it this way. So the broad structure of book 3 on the Trinity is usually the way that any one particular doctrine in book 2 is dealt with. So that he begins with a definition, and then he will do one of two things. He will usually will break that definition down into its constituent parts and explain them in greater detail. Not always, but usually he'll do that. And then he will give you some scriptural demonstrations. He'll give you some logical demonstrations, and then he will give you some axioms. And again, the axioms are weird because they come at the end. And then if there is any debate, he will deal with the sort of the polemics at the end of that. And then he'll do the application section at the end of most of the chapters in book 2. And so minus the application part, which he obviously doesn't have at the end of book 3, that sort of, we're going to begin with the high level definitions and distinctions, and then we're going to go into the axioms, and then we're going to go into the polemics. That broader structure is kind of, you see it replicated chapter after chapter, or topic and doctrine after doctrine in book 2. So it's interesting that he would kind of go back and forth between them, between those two chapters or books, but that's what he did.
Yeah, it's interesting that there's not an overarching systematic plan in mind for how he's going to deal with everything. He'll get to things and he'll sort of come up with a systematic, a method that fits that area.
Yeah, well, and I mean, that's where I want to be careful. I don't want to say there isn't one. I just don't know what it is. So, because that's part of what intrigues me about him is, so for instance, when he's dealing with the various essential properties that he all collects under the divine will, so love and mercy and compassion and clemency and those different things, some of those he does the same way he's always done them. He gives a definition, he talks about some distinctions, and then he goes on. Some of them, he begins with scholastic questions. Whether this exists, what is it? What are its parts? And he includes those highly scholastic, highly sort of medieval scholastic questions and how he goes through them. And then the next chapter, he does the same thing with the second one, and then he flips back to the original structure where he doesn't ask any scholastic questions at all. And so it almost seems haphazard, and maybe it is. But you also wonder, is there something more? Is there a reason why he does it the way he does it?
I've been suspicious myself that part of the explanation for the at least appearance of haphazardness is that most of this work has been cobbled together via lecture notes, scraps of disputations that have been refined over a large number of disputation cycles. There's various ways of doing different disputations, the on sit, quid sit scholastic method of those scholastic questions versus axioms. I've suspected that this 18 axioms, again, just using English translation, 18 axioms and the Trinity, might have been something like a disputation at some point. And it just feels like it to me. I've translated a fairly large number of disputations during this time period from various theologians, and translating this as well. It just feels very, very similar. And so you bring all these pieces together, and that might be some explanation for why there's some surface level cosmetic differences in his treatment of various items. It's been my suspicion anyway.
Yeah, well, and too, when you think about it, I mean, he doesn't know, I'm assuming he doesn't know it's the end of his life, but it comes at the end of his life. And so that 14-year period, particularly of teaching, which perhaps explains some of the distinctions between what he's doing in the Partitiones and then the first edition, the second edition, and then this edition. In fact, one of the things that I look at is where his understanding of the doctrine of simplicity comes in, because in the first edition of the Partitiones, he doesn't include simplicity as a attribute of God at all. Now he references the simple essence later on, but in terms of enumerating the attributes, he doesn't bring it in. But then in the 1599 edition of the Partitiones, he does, and it becomes the key, the main, the lead attribute that he begins with, and that also continues on into the syntagma. And so perhaps that comes about from his teaching and his his importance of the simplicity, because it doesn't just add it in, it becomes, again, it's the first one that he deals with.
And it becomes an argument recurrent throughout many of the other quote unquote ontological attributes. He's continually bringing the simplicity in the rest of the syntagma, I've noticed.
Yeah, well, and not just in what he would call like the first order attributes,
Yep.
but even the second order attributes, the ones that we might call communicable. He still will, the difference between the way wisdom is in us versus the way wisdom is in God. Wisdom in God is simple.
Yeah.
And so it's not in us. And so it continues to be through all of that. So it's interesting how, I mean, and it's actually almost shocking that it's not in the first edition. You're like, wait a minute, God's lots of things, but he's also simple. Where is simplicity? But now he doesn't deny it, because as I say, there's a portion where he describes the essence of God as simple. It's actually in the Trinity section he does that. But so he clearly understands that God is simple, but why he wouldn't include that as an attribute, I don't know. So let me actually, that's another good segue into connecting sort of what I was doing with what you guys have been doing. So one of the things that I tried to do in my dissertation, the main thing I was doing was trying to provide a modern day reader sort of a guided tour of book 2 of the Syntagma. Obviously there's lots of Latin, but there's also lots of English, and there's analysis as I go through. What is this? Where does it come from? What does it mean? So it's not just, I mean, certainly not a translation at all, but it's not just sort of a guided tour, but how do we understand these sections together independently? How do they all work together? how do we understand them in the context of Reformed Orthodoxy generally? But another thing that I was doing is looking at secondary literature's understanding of Polanus, and kind of distilling it down to sort of three main criticisms of his work. So first of all, that predestination functions as a central dogma in his theology, which I was able to sort of walk away that, standing on the shoulders of many other people. What's that?
C.F. Muller.
Yes, exactly. Another, also C. Muller, is that he's rationalistic. So obviously there's an enormous use of reason, but using reason is different from being rationalistic. But the other thing that was interesting, and certainly not unique, not a unique criticism of Polanus. It's used of a lot of different theologians from this time period, but that in starting with the attributes, that the Trinity somehow becomes sort of a problem for Polanus, either to sort of hide or to push off till the end. That Trinity is not at the forefront of what Polanus is doing in the attributes. And so one of the things I wanted to do is demonstrate that that's actually not what's going on. So there's a couple of things that are kind of interesting to see. So first of all, just as Polanus begins to distribute the doctrine of God, so the doctrine of God is two things: essence and operations, right? So it's the essence of God and the works of God. The essence of God is what is divided into attributes and persons. And so at the end of book 3, you get this interesting, actually it's the beginning of book 4, sorry, you get this interesting statement at the end of a book talking all about the Trinity, thus far the essence of God. Because for Polanus, the essence of God is both his attributes and his persons. And you cannot, I mean, usually you think of essence and person, right? One essence, three in person, but Polanus, whether we like that or not, that's not the way Polanus organizes it. It's attributes in persons.
That is so
Ryan
fantastic. Wait, you say that's the end of book 3 or the beginning of book 4?
I think it's the beginning of book 4. It's like thus far, we've looked at the essence of God, and then now we're going to look at the operations or the works of God.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah. And so throughout then book 2, he is constantly referring to the Trinity. It's not that Trinity doesn't exist. It is, you find it throughout. You find it in his definition of God. When he defines God, I mean, technically he's describing God, he's not defining God. But he includes both realities of his essential oneness, the oneness of his essence, but also his triune subsistence. So, I mean, both of those are there in the very definition at the beginning of book 2. Actually, when he goes to simplicity, one of the reasons why simplicity is so important is because simplicity secures Trinity. And if God is not simple, then he's a triplex God, or he's a threefold God. He's not triune. When he talks about glory and a whole other host of different attributes, he will make a distinction between the essential glory of God and the personal glory of God, or the essential wisdom of God and the personal wisdom of God, and does it throughout all of that. When he talks about love, he makes a distinction between a necessary ad intra love between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and then a voluntary ad extra love that God demonstrates towards his creation. And so, again, all throughout this, it's not just that, oh, Trinity is this thing that we have to tack on at the end because we know that there are three who are God, but all throughout that discussion of God's attributes, God's names, God's essential properties. In fact, some of the names, he'll point out that this name of God, and he's thinking about God broadly speaking, right? I mean, God in terms of his essence, not any individual person. This name demonstrates the triunity of God. Now, maybe not everybody today would be, all the Old Testament professors would be equally as convinced by him. But the point is that he recognizes that Trinity, right? The Trinity of persons is something that cannot be hidden or cannot wait until the end. It has to be brought in throughout his discussion.
Yeah, those are two good examples with simplicity and with Trinity of is the question whether you draw out and make explicit or thematic an important topic. It's really a secondary question, right? The question is whether it's operative throughout the system. You can actually write a doctrine of God without talking much about simplicity and never drawing out your thoughts on simplicity and making it a point of doctrine.
Right. Well, and he does that. I mean, he actually does that in the particularity. So,
right.
You know, it's, but also, you know, I think that it's a distinction between, you know, sort of the way we do theology now, sort of, and a lot of times it is the way we do theology in reaction to those who are reacting to, you know, it just kind of goes back and forth. But you know, Polanus begins where he does because, I mean, if nothing else, because he's a good Ramist. And a Ramist is going to begin with what's general before he moves on to what's more specific. And the essence of God is more general, whereas the personal relations are more specific. And so, I mean, it's not because he doesn't love Jesus or something. It's because you know, that's just the way he wants to organize things. So yeah, so it's definitely not, or put it positively, it's definitely something that is key in his understanding of who God is, and you see it throughout book 2, which you would expect to see it, but it's neat to be able to see it and then point it out.
Yeah. Well, that is very helpful. We've given a lot of attention to this one small set of pages in the Axiomata, and had to acknowledge repeatedly, like, I can't figure out why this is doing what it's doing here, or, you know, why is 14 such a big, elaborate, well-constructed set piece in the middle of a series that doesn't have that character. So it's interesting to hear the way what we're seeing in this little microcosm of the syntagma is in fact showing up elsewhere as well.
Well, he does. I mean, he does similar things. I mean, you'll get 10 axioms. 9 of them will be one sentence, and 1 of them will be 7 pages. Well, maybe not that bad, but, you know, several paragraphs anyway. And very rarely is there any rhyme or reason. I mean, again, back to why. I mean, he doesn't tell you why. And I think, I mean, one of the criticisms that I would have of Polanus, if he were with us today on this call, would be it's often very difficult to figure out why he does what he does. And then you have to guess. And maybe your guess is right, but why, you know, and this is something that Dolph Tavilda and I have discussed a number of times, and he would just say, that's just the way they did things back then. Okay. That's fine, but still, it would be nice if there was just a little bit more structure. I mean, not structure, but explanation for the structure that is.
Yeah. Now, there's not a ton of secondary literature out there on Polanus, and Robert Letham's article that shows up, you know, first thing you hit when you do a search for stuff is his article subtitled "A Neglected Theologian." I mean, big picture, Polanus is not a household word, household name. Can you talk about his neglected status? Because he's also influential, right?
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that's really interesting is that everybody talks about him, but hardly anybody, you know, in terms of secondary literature, hardly anybody really interacts with him all that well. So you see him, I mean, obviously you see him throughout Barth, you see him, actually Hep will make a number of references to him as well. He's all throughout Muller's PRRD. So there's a lot of references to him. And a lot of times he'll be brought out as sort of an, you know, in defense of what we're saying or what I'm saying. But in terms of really looking through and trying to understand him in his own context, it's very, very rare.
I've recently read through Barth's Doctrine of God just for fun, and I noticed his quotations of Polanus.
Understanding of fun.
Well, we're also now we're 3 guys on the internet talking about Polanus. So, yeah. But he's always pulling the definition, and he's rarely pulling much more. So that initial several lines, usually one sentence, difficult to translate, as you know, Steve, that starts off every attribute nearly, just rips that right up, and that's I noticed.
Well, and then those, so the two works that really are looking at Polanus, Fallenbach and Deal. Fallenbach is, he writes, I think it's the structure, I mean, it's in German, but the structure of Polanus's theology. And he deals a lot more with Polanus's doctrine of Scripture, which is something we haven't even talked about. I mean, he has this gargantuan section of the doctrine of Scripture, which I did the math, it's like 18% of the whole syntagma is on the doctrine of Scripture. That's a big section. Anyway, so Fallenbach does a lot with that, but then Fallenbach is also, broadly speaking, kind of Bardian or neo-Orthodox. So he brings those same criticisms of Polanus. So it's central dogma, it's rationalistic, etc. Max Eugene Deal is a University of Edinburgh PhD dissertation written in 1980, I think. And it's interesting. Didn't agree with it hardly ever, but it was interesting.
Yeah.
The ideas that it had. So, I mean, up to this point, you either get Polanus is just one of our guys, which is fine because he is, assuming you are Reformed. But he's one of our guys. Okay, that's great. But not really dealing with his particular views or the idiosyncrasies of his views sometimes. Or you get people that are basically saying, he's wrong on a lot of things. And that's one of the things where just even like in Muller, the way he uses Polanus very often, as you go through, particularly the I think is it book 2 that's on the essence and attributes and the PRD. Anyway, whichever one it is, he will at the beginning of those chapters he will use the synopsis of Polanus. Which is funny because very rarely does anybody else ever structure their doctrine of God the way Polanus does. So it's almost like, okay, that was fun, but nobody does it that way. So it was kind of interesting to see those distinctions, which are oftentimes distinctions that people might use, but rarely, if ever, in the same way that Polanus does. So I think that he's neglected because you can't find him in English, and unfortunately, right now, particularly in America, theology students just don't read Latin. I don't read Latin well, but certainly most people don't read it at all. And if they're going to, for whatever, it's just harder to find. And there are so many other theologians like Polanus, and then there are so many others that you can read a lot about. So. Hopefully he'll be a little bit less after what you guys have been trying to do and what I've done, and I want to continue even my own work and trying to look at other aspects of what Polanus is doing. But I think the other characterization, and you see it in Leuven and you see it elsewhere, is not just that Polanus is neglected, but actually if you read Leuven's article, you'd almost wonder why you would want to read it at all, because he characterizes Polanus as a compiler. Actually, he's quoting Bitzer's. Let's see, what is it? So Bitzer writes the preface, I think, to Hepp's Reformed Dogmatics, and in the preface, what's that?
Yeah, I was agreeing. I was trying to think where did I know the name Bitzer?
Yeah. He writes the preface, and in that preface, he describes Polanus as a compiler. He actually uses the word epigon, or I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right because I've never heard that word before. I looked it up. It's actually not a nice thing to say about someone. So it is, what's that?
It's not a compliment.
No, it's an inferior imitator is what it means, right? And so basically, if that's the case, then why would you spend any time studying him at all? Now, and Leuven talks about there's no daring new departures, right? As if anybody in the Reformed Orthodox period was interested in being described as going off in daring new directions. That's Arminius, that's Socinus. Those are not the guys you want to be grouped with, daring new departures in theology, at least from their perspective. So in that sense, very few people were doing anything daring or new. Calvin isn't really even doing anything daring and new. But also even in the sense of the way in which he is, you might even say, okay, is he imitating Zonky or Unius, or is he imitating Ursinus? And one of the phrases that I use in my work is both adopting, but also adapting. He adopts and he adapts these works. So it's not that he takes these ideas and just collects them, any of these ideas, and just collects them together. But first of all, just to put them in the structure in which he does. So his structure of, let's say, his discussion of archetypal, ectypal. All of his definitions, all of his distinctions are very, very similar to what Unius does. But he does them in an entirely different structure because, well, Polanus is a Ramist and Unius isn't. And so the way he structures it is different. And in order to take somebody else's idea and restructure them, right, not only do you have to make them your own, but you have to really understand what they're saying. And so I think that both of those two, so he adapts or he adopts them, but he also adapts them to his particular purpose. And you see the same thing, I mean, throughout with Zonky. I mean, one of the things that Polanus gets from Zonky, probably, I mean, again, to say that you get it, you know who you get it from can be difficult. But one of the things that seems clear that he's getting from Zonky is his application sections.
Mm.
So in book 2, in most of the chapters at the end, he has these uses. You don't find them hardly anywhere else in the Syntagma, but you find them in book 2 because you find, I mean, not because, but interestingly enough, you also find them in Zonky. We'll just put it that way. But Zonky's uses and Polanus's uses are entirely different. I mean, first of all, he's not copying what Zonky's doing, but neither is the structure the same, right? Polanus has a 5-fold way of looking at the usus, and it's always those 5 ways, and it's never 4, it's never 6, it's always these 5 ways. And so even though, okay, clearly he is getting the importance of application, both from Zonky, but also even from his own Ramist structure, the way he puts things together, because Ramists are really interested in ethics and application anyway. But he doesn't just copy, he adapts, he puts it his own spin on it. And so again, I find it difficult, having read through book 2 and certainly a lot of book 3 and book 4, finding him a inferior imitator is not the sense that I get from him. And in fact, I just, for me anyway, I find him incredibly readable, incredibly easy to understand for the most part. I mean, and a lot of the problems that I have with it are, just my own facility with Latin. Whoever his printer is needs to get new Greek fonts. Those are horrendous. And, just the difficulties of, I mean, it's a marvelous thing that I can download the entire syntagma from the internet. It's not a great thing when a whole page is smudged, and I have no idea.
Yes, this is true.
I guess you take the good with the bad and go with it. So.
Yeah. All right. Well, this has been great, Steve. I feel like I've been groping around in a cave, understanding bits and pieces of Polanus, and you're coming down from an upper world with lots more light, having looked specifically at Polanus for a long time.
We're talking about a different person right now.
Yeah, little Platonic image there. But,
Well, yeah, and like I said, I mean, I did really appreciate listening to what you guys had to say, and part of this was just trying to give people kind of a broader overview of Polanus and then the syntagma in general. But there's so much to dig into any particular area and really try to get our head around, what is this? Where does it come from? What role does it play in his overall theology? Why is he doing this? Why is he focused on that? Maybe if you guys shift into the doctrine of the essence and the attributes, I'll come back on and we can talk some more about it.
Yeah, certainly either of those 2 parts of the doctrine of God helped me with the message that I'm trying to communicate to people, that there are Protestant theologians in the entire history of the movement who have looked at these doctrines with a particular, with a real breadth, not sort of the standard things you would guess. Well, Protestants don't really do that doctrine in that way, do they? Well, actually, thinking more broadly about who the Protestants have been, we have fielded theologians who have gone at it in this larger minded way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well,
Thank
too,
you.
I mean, I think that would be interesting, even just in looking at Polanus. I mean, in the things that I've seen, Polanus has no problem doing things differently than other people. I mean, so some of the distinctions he makes, again, they completely die away, or that they're not picked up by anybody else. And so I'd imagine even in these axioms, I mean, again, what is unique and what is part of that broader Reformed discussion. That's something you have to look at each individual piece of, but also to recognize that again, there are going to be some things that he's going to do that maybe, I don't want to say daring new departures, but maybe somewhat daring new departures, just depends on the individual topic. And so it's helpful both in the sense of the broad view of what Reformed Orthodoxy is, but in placing him in that continuity and see what gets picked up by later theologians. One of the things I was doing was looking at Levius and just saying, okay, the next guy, is there anything that he leaves behind? And that may be helpful too, just looking at his doctrine of Trinity and saying, okay, is there a continuity with all of this? Or how does he structure it? How does he pull any of that together? So yeah, just putting him in the context of recognizing that he's worthy of study for his own sake, but also that he exists within an academic community, a scholastic community, and how all those things work together, how those individuals are playing off of each other and growing from each other, and then to see those distinctions just, oh, we're not going to make that one anymore because our opponents jumped all over that error that we made or whatever, so we're not going to do that again, but then we'll, or we have to go back to the drawing board now and make sure that those distinctions are tighter. So that whole growth of Reformed scholastic theology is also really interesting.
Yeah. I appreciated the way he put perichoresis in a proper context, so that it was, you got all the value of it, but without it taking over the whole system. But also when he had to come back and keep sort of tagging autotheos a couple of times in a way that I thought really was helpfully clarifying, right? That autotheos is a thing we affirm in this way over here.
Yeah.
But again, it doesn't run rampant through the system and overturn other things.
Well, yeah, I mean, particularly for me, again, because I didn't do a lot of work in the Trinity, but as I was trying to gather all that together, I mean, the idea that Christ, for instance, is autotheos with reference to his essence, but not reference to his person. I don't think I've ever heard that in modern theological discussions of the Trinity. I mean, maybe everybody just knew that and I just didn't or something, but to have that distinction laid out for me was so helpful in thinking through, okay, how do you put these things together? And how do you put together, an ordering of the persons without having subordinationism, which obviously is a big kind of topic today in theological. So how all of those things work together. I mean, again, he's not answering our questions, he's answering his own questions, but it's helpful just the way he puts things. Well, all right, it's helpful the way we translate him to put things.
Yeah. Good. Well, thanks for being with us. We need to bring this to a close, but really appreciate hearing from you today.
Yeah, thank you, Steve, so much. Really a privilege.
Well, and let me also just say thanks to Ryan. Ryan checked a lot of my Latin work, probably, I don't know, almost all of it, not quite all of it. And he would send me back these pages that were just dripping in red ink of all of the mistakes that I had made. It was very, very helpful, and would not have finished without him. So I really appreciate his work in checking my translations and just a lot of the very insightful comments that he would have throughout. So you've got a really great translator here working with you.
It's kind of you, brother. Appreciate it. All right. We'll see you guys.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks.